I'm not sure what felt heavier, my gear or the weight in my gut. The kind you get when you're walking into something you don't understand but know is bad. We'd just landed on some nameless speck in the Pacific. Not that we cared about the name. All that mattered was it was ours now. At least that's what the brass said. We'd come in right after the big push, once the Navy and the flyboys had done their thing. The fighting was supposed to be over. Still, when you're a Marine, there's always the chance someone forgot to tell the other side. "Eyes sharp, boys," Sergeant Mack said, his voice low and steady, like it always was. Mack was the kind of guy you trusted without thinking about it. Big, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked like it could take a bullet and keep going. Just because the shooting stopped doesn't mean the dying did. I followed in line, sweat already dripping into places I'd rather not think about. The jungle swallowed us up right off the bat, a wall of green so thick it felt like the island itself was trying to keep us out. Bugs buzzed so loud it felt like they were screaming right in my ears. The air smelled like salt, rot, and something sweet I couldn't place but didn't trust. "Hell of a place for a vacation," Private Gonzalez muttered behind me. Gonzalez was always running his mouth, a habit that had gotten him both in and out of trouble more times than I could count. "Think they'll let me build a beach shack after this is all over?" "Sure," Corporal Andrews shot back. "You'll be real cozy. Just you, the malaria, and all these damn mosquitoes." Laughter rippled through the group, but it felt forced. I didn't join in. Something about this place made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the jungle, too quiet under the racket of bugs. Or maybe it was the whispers I thought I heard, faint, just on the edge of hearing, like the trees were talking to each other. By the time we set up camp, the sun was already starting to dip. Mac had us in a clearing not far from the beach, a patch of ground we hacked out with machetes and curses. The squad was 10 men strong, all of us dirty, tired, and trying not to think about how far from home we were. "Jennings, Andrews, Gonzalez," Mac barked. "You're on first watch. Rest of you, get some shut-eye. We're moving at first light." Great. Just what I wanted. I didn't complain, though. Complaining got you nowhere in the Corps, and besides, I wasn't the only one pulling the short straw. Andrews set himself up with his rifle aimed at the tree line, his face set in a permanent scowl. Gonzalez sat nearby, cleaning his knife like he thought he'd need it any second. I took my spot facing the jungle, my rifle across my knees. The whispers were back, faint but insistent. I told myself it was just the wind, but the trees weren't moving, not even a little. "You hear that?" Gonzalez asked after a while. His voice was quieter than usual, almost nervous. "Hear what?" Andrews snapped, not looking away from the tree line. I don't know, voices." I glanced at Gonzalez. His dark eyes were scanning the jungle, his usual smirk gone. "It's just the bugs," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Bugs don't sound like people," he muttered. He went back to cleaning his knife, but his hands were shaking. The night dragged on, and the whispers didn't stop. At some point, I thought I saw something move between the trees, a shadow darker than the rest, quick and silent. "You see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Andrews frowned, his grip tightening on his rifle. "See what?" "Something out there," I said, nodding toward the jungle. "Probably a monkey," Gonzalez said, though he didn't sound convinced, "or a Jap who doesn't know the war's over." We stared into the darkness for a long time, but nothing moved. Eventually, Mac came to relieve us, and I was too tired to argue when he told me to get some rest. I crawled into my foxhole, pulled my helmet over my eyes, and tried not to think about the whispers. The next morning, we found the bunker. It was half buried in the jungle, the concrete cracked and covered in moss. Mac led the way, his pistol drawn. The air inside was cooler, but it smelled worse than the jungle, like rust, mildew, and something else. Something wrong. "Stay sharp," Mac said, his voice echoing off the walls. We spread out, flashlights cutting through the dim. The place was a mess. Papers scattered everywhere, overturned chairs, a table with a leg snapped clean off. The walls were covered in writing, Japanese characters I couldn't read scrawled in black ink that had dripped like blood. "Looks like they left in a hurry," Andrews said, kicking over an empty tin can. Gonzalez pointed to one of the walls. "What the hell is that?" I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Symbols were carved into the concrete, deep and jagged. Circles, triangles, and shapes that didn't make any sense. My eyes kept sliding off them like they weren't meant to be seen. "Just some Jap superstition," Mac said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's keep moving." We didn't find much else. A few rusted weapons, some rotting rations, and a torn flag. But something about that place stuck with me. It felt wrong, like the air was too heavy, pressing down on my chest. That night the whispers were louder. I couldn't understand them, but they sounded almost familiar, like someone I used to know. I dreamed of shadows moving in the jungle, eyes watching me from the trees. When I woke up, there was a katana sticking out of the ground near the edge of the camp. The blade was broken, the metal rusted, but it was surrounded by strange symbols painted in dried, dark streaks. "Who the hell put that there?" Mac demanded, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. No one answered. No one even moved. We just stood there, staring at it, the whispers swirling around us like the jungle was breathing. Morning came slow, dragging its feet like it knew what waited for us in the daylight. The katana stood there, half buried in the ground, its rusted blade catching weak slivers of sunlight through the jungle canopy. None of us wanted to touch it, but we couldn't stop staring either. It felt like the thing was watching us, even though that didn't make a lick of sense. "We're leaving it," Mac finally said, breaking the silence. His tone didn't invite argument, but it didn't matter. No one was about to fight him on that. "Good call," Gonzalez muttered, though his usual grin was nowhere in sight. He kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected the jungle to lunge at him. That thing gives me the creeps. We packed up camp quickly and started moving inland. The mission was still the mission: scout the area, look for anything useful, and make damn sure there weren't any Japanese soldiers hiding out. But it felt like something had shifted. The jungle wasn't just hot and suffocating anymore. It was alive, its shadows longer and darker than they should have been. The whispers followed us, growing bolder. Sometimes they sounded close, like someone breathing right next to your ear. Other times, they faded into the background, just loud enough to make sure you knew they were there. "I swear I just saw someone," Andrews said after an hour of hiking. He was looking back the way we'd come, his rifle tight in his hands. "Out there between the trees." "Nobody's out there," Max said, his voice firm. "Eyes front, Corporal. Don't lose focus." Andrews didn't look convinced, but he nodded and turned back to the trail. I caught Gonzalez's eye, and he gave me a nervous shrug. It wasn't just Andrews seeing things. I'd caught flashes too. Shapes move in the corners of my vision, just far enough away to make me doubt myself. It was near midday when we found the shrine. The clearing opened up like the jungle had been holding its breath and finally let it out. The shrine was small but unsettling, carved out of weathered stone that didn't match anything else on the island. Twisted humanoid figures were etched into its surface, their faces contorted in agony. Some had no eyes, others had mouths stretched wide in silent screams. "Jesus Christ," Gonzalez muttered, crossing himself. "What the hell is this place?" Andrews asked, stepping closer despite the unease that seemed to radiate from the shrine. Mac's jaw was tight. "Stay sharp. Check the perimeter." We spread out, but there wasn't much to see. The jungle pressed in close, almost claustrophobic. The shrine stood at the center of the clearing like it had been waiting for us. I couldn't help but stare at the carvings. The longer I looked, the more it felt like the figures were moving, their twisted limbs shifting ever so slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. "You hear that?" Gonzalez said, breaking the silence. His voice was shaky. "Hear what?" I asked, though I already knew. "The humming," he said. "It's coming from the shrine." I strained my ears, and sure enough, there it was. A low, metallic hum, so faint it was more a feeling than a sound. It crawled under my skin, setting my teeth on edge. "We're leaving," Max said abruptly. "Now. Jennings, mark the location on the map. We'll report it when we get back to base." I nodded and pulled out the map, but my hands were shaking so bad it took me 3 tries to mark the spot. By the time we started moving again, the whispers were louder than ever, and I could swear they were laughing. That night, we set up camp near a dried-up stream. It felt like the jungle was closing in, the trees crowding together to keep us from leaving. No one said much. Even Gonzalez, who always had some wisecrack ready, stayed quiet. When darkness fell, the whispers came back in force. They weren't just noise anymore. They were words, half-formed and just barely out of reach. Sometimes they sounded like Japanese. Other times they sounded like, well, like home. I sat on watch, my rifle across my lap, and tried not to listen. The others were restless, shifting in their sleep or muttering under their breath. Gonzalez was tossing and turning like he was caught in a nightmare. Then he sat bolt upright, his eyes wide and unseeing. "They're here," he said, his voice flat and distant. "What the hell are you talking about?" I asked, my heart pounding. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood and started walking toward the jungle. "Gonzalez, stop!" I hissed, grabbing his arm. He turned to me, and for a moment I thought I was looking at someone else. His eyes were wrong, darker than they should have been, like the pupils had swallowed everything else. "Let go," he said, his voice low and cold. "Jennings, what's going on?" Mac's voice cut through the tension like a knife. I looked back, and Gonzalez blinked, his expression clearing. I don't know," he said, shaking his head like he was trying to wake up. I had to go." Mac's eyes narrowed, but he didn't push it. "Everyone stay on alert," he said. "We're not alone out here." We made it through the night, but just barely. By morning, Gonzalez looked pale and shaken like he hadn't slept at all. The rest of us weren't much better. As we packed up camp, Andrews stopped suddenly, his eyes fixed on the tree line. "There," he said, pointing. "Do you see it?" I followed his gaze, and my blood ran cold. A figure stood between the trees, just far enough away to blur into the shadows. It wore a tattered Japanese uniform, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, and it wasn't moving. "What the hell?" I whispered. Mac raised his pistol, but before he could fire, the figure was gone. No movement, no sound, just gone. "We're leaving," Mac said, his voice tight. "Now." The jungle didn't just feel alive anymore. It felt aware, watching us, listening to our every step. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch sent shivers down my spine. We didn't speak much, just kept our heads down and tried to put as much distance between us and whatever we saw. But the whispers wouldn't let up. They weren't just whispers now. They were a chorus, a rising tide of voices that felt like they were crawling into my skull. By midday, we reached a ridge overlooking the island's interior. From there, we could see what looked like another structure hidden deep in the jungle. It wasn't like the bunker we'd found earlier. This was older and more worn, its stone walls almost swallowed by the surrounding vegetation. It looked out of place, like it belonged to a different time, or a different world. Max set his jaw and looked at the map, then back at the structure. "We're checking it out. Whatever's going on here, it's tied to that place." Nobody argued. What was the point? It wasn't like we could just walk away from this, not anymore. The approach to the structure felt like walking into the mouth of a beast. The jungle grew denser, the air heavier. The whispers grew louder with every step, and now they had a rhythm, a cadence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just noise, it was chanting. When we finally reached the structure, the temperature seemed to drop. The air inside was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. The walls were covered in the same strange carvings we'd seen at the shrine, but here they were more detailed, more deliberate. The figures looked almost human, but their proportions were all wrong. Too long, too thin, their faces twisted in expressions of pain and ecstasy. "What is this place?" Andrews asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Looks like some kind of temple," Gonzalez said, though his usual bravado was gone. "A damn creepy one." "Keep your eyes open," Max said, his voice steady but tense. "And stay together." We moved deeper into the temple, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The walls seemed to close the farther we went, the carvings growing more chaotic, more grotesque. And then we found the altar. It was a slab of stone, slick with some kind of black, tar-like substance that pooled around its base. Symbols were etched into its surface, and in the center lay a small object wrapped in faded cloth. Mac hesitated, then stepped forward and unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a strange artifact, a small idol carved from a dark, unidentifiable material. It was shaped like one of the twisted figures on the walls, its eyes hollow and its mouth wide open, as if screaming. "What the hell is that?" Gonzalez asked, his voice trembling. "It's what we've been looking for," Max said, though he didn't sound happy about it. He wrapped the idol back up and tucked it into his pack. "We're taking it back. Maybe someone smarter than us can figure out what's going on here." "I don't like this," Andrews said, glancing over his shoulder. "Feels like we're waking something up." He wasn't wrong. The moment Mac took the idol, the chanting grew louder, more insistent. The air grew heavier, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. "Let's move," Mac said. "Now!" The journey back to camp was a nightmare. The jungle seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and bending as if trying to trap us. The chanting followed us, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was inside my head. And then the attack started. It began with shadows darting through the trees, too fast to get a good look at. Then came the sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, footsteps just behind us but always out of sight. We'd stop and spin around, but there was never anything there. "We're being hunted," Andrews said, his voice barely audible over the whispers. "Keep moving," Mac ordered. "Stay together and keep moving." But it didn't matter. Whatever was out there wasn't playing by our rules. The first to go was Gonzalez. 1 second he was there, walking right in front of me, and the next he was gone, pulled into the shadows with a scream that cut off too fast. We searched for him, but all we found was his helmet, cracked and covered in the same black substance we'd seen on the altar. Next was Andrews. He didn't even scream. One moment he was there, and the next, he was just gone, like the jungle had swallowed him whole. By the time we reached camp, there were only 4 of us left. Me, Mac, Private Stevens, and Corporal Haynes. We barricaded ourselves in the clearing, setting up a perimeter with what little we had left. But it didn't feel like enough. Nothing would have been enough. "What do we do, Sarge?" Haynes asked, his voice shaking. Mac didn't answer right away. He just stared at the jungle, his jaw tight. Finally, he said, "We wait for morning. Whatever's out there, it'll have a harder time hiding in the daylight." But the daylight never came. The hours dragged on, the darkness growing deeper, the whispers louder. And then the trees began to move. Not the wind, not animals. The trees themselves, their branches twisting and reaching toward us like skeletal hands. The ground beneath us trembled, and the air grew so thick it felt like breathing molasses. "It's the idol," I said suddenly, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. "We need to put it back." Mac looked at me, his expression torn between anger and desperation. And walk back through that hellhole? You think that'll fix this? Do we have a choice? I shot back. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Mac nodded, pulling the idol from his pack. All right, we'll take it back. But we move fast, and we stay together. Got it. We didn't make it far. Haynes was the next to go, dragged screaming into the darkness. Then Stevens, his rifle firing wildly before he was silenced. By the time we reached the temple, it was just me and Mac. We placed the idol back on the altar, but it didn't stop. The whispers turned to screams, the shadows closing in, and then nothing. Just darkness. When I woke up, I was alone. The temple was gone, and the jungle was silent. I stumbled back to the beach where a rescue team found me days later. They said I was the only survivor, but I know better. The island didn't let them go. It just let me leave. And sometimes in the dead of night, I can still hear the whispers. Thanks for watching. What did you think of the story? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories like this.